They began as mentor and protégé, a dynamic duo that helped shape the golden era of late-night television. But behind the laughter, something broke between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers. A bond once built on trust and admiration suddenly collapsed, leaving behind silence that lasted a lifetime. For decades, no one truly knew what happened. Carson never spoke of it, taking his version of the story to the grave. And Joan? She carried the weight quietly. Until now, years after her death, one emotional revelation has resurfaced, shedding light on the pain, ambition, and betrayal that tore apart one of Hollywood's most legendary partnerships. Why Johnny Carson never forgave her. Joan Malinsky, born in Brooklyn in 1933, never set out to become a comedian. Her dream, at first, was to be a dramatic actress. But by the mid-1950s, she shifted into comedy, partly as a way to keep those bigger theatrical ambitions alive. At that time, stand-up was dominated almost entirely by men, and Joan was one of the very few women daring to break into the scene. For nearly a decade, she hustled as a writer and performer, working clubs alongside future icons like Woody Allen, Richard Pryor, and George Carlin. But while her peers started gaining recognition, Joan found herself still grinding it out in smaller venues, performing sharp, female-driven material that set her apart, but hadn't yet propelled her forward. Her personal life wasn't offering stability either. A first marriage ended quickly in divorce, leaving her at a crossroads by the mid-1960s. The big question was, what next? The turning point came in 1965, when Joan landed a spot on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. For a comedian, Carson's stage was the ultimate launchpad, and Joan's performance that night changed everything. She often credited Carson as the man who gave her a career, and their bond would shape her professional life for years. By the late 1960s, she had her first taste of hosting with a short-lived program called That Show with Joan Rivers. She kept building momentum, popping up regularly on The Tonight Show and appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show. Through the 1970s, she became a familiar face on television, a regular on Hollywood squares, and a major draw in Las Vegas, proving she was now firmly in the spotlight. Her creativity also extended behind the camera. She co-wrote the TV movie The Girl Most Likely To, and later directed Rabbit Test, a comedy starring Billy Crystal in the role of a pregnant man, an offbeat project that showed her willingness to take risks. By 1983, Joan Rivers had solidified her status as a powerhouse. 2 best-selling books, a Grammy-nominated comedy album, and a devoted fan base were just part of her growing empire. That same year, Carson officially named her permanent guest host of The Tonight Show, a position that cemented her as one of the top figures in comedy. But the mid-1980s brought a dramatic shift. In 1986, Joan made history when the brand-new Fox network gave her a late-night talk show of her own, The Late Show with Joan Rivers. It was groundbreaking. She became the first woman ever to host a late-night talk show. But it also put her in direct competition with Carson, the man who had championed her. For years, she had remained loyal to him, turning down offers from rival networks out of respect. Yet in 1985, a change in contracts unsettled her. Carson signed for 2 more years, while she was offered only 1, a departure from her previous 2-year deals. To Joan, that signaled doubt about her future. In her memoir, she recalled believing it meant the network was considering other replacements for Carson. And despite her role as his permanent guest host, she claimed her name wasn't even on the list. The decision to launch her own show marked the start of one of the most pivotal and painful chapters of her career. In early 1986, Joan Rivers was approached with a game-changing offer from Barry Diller and the executives behind the brand-new Fox television network. Fox was just about to launch, and as the scrappy underdog going up against the television giants ABC, CBS, and NBC, it needed a big, attention-grabbing move. The plan was bold: offer Joan Rivers her own late-night talk show for an unprecedented $10 million. If she accepted, she would become the first woman to ever host a late-night show. The deal came with another incentive. Fox agreed to bring on Joan's husband, Edgar Rosenberg, as the show's producer. It was an unusual arrangement, but it was crucial for Joan, and ultimately, it helped convince her to take the leap. The decision, however, carried enormous risk. Others before her had tried to step away from The Tonight Show and create competing programs, but they had all failed. The key difference was that those performers had Johnny Carson's blessing. Joan assumed her path would be the same. The negotiations with Fox were carried out in complete secrecy. Joan later admitted that she avoided telling Carson because she was afraid the deal might collapse if he knew too early. She also pointed out that NBC executives had discouraged anyone from bringing difficult matters to Carson, who was infamous for his temper. The secrecy, however, changed everything. Before Joan could make an official announcement, word of the new show leaked. Carson didn't hear it from her, he heard it from Fox. Furious, he refused to take her call, hung up on her, and banned her from The Tonight Show permanently. He never spoke to her again, not even during Jay Leno's later tenure as host. To make matters worse, Carson reportedly barred any guest from his show if they appeared on Joan's competing program. The Late Show with Joan Rivers debuted on Fox in 1986, but the fallout from her split with Carson overshadowed the milestone. For Joan, the personal pain lingered long after. In a reflective essay for The Hollywood Reporter, she described how devastating it was to be cut off by someone she had admired and worked alongside for years. She recalled approaching Carson in restaurants to say hello, only to be ignored completely. Joan struggled to make sense of his anger. She believed Carson viewed her differently because she was a woman, suggesting that he assumed she would remain loyal and never branch out on her own. In her eyes, his fury came not just from the career move itself, but from the fact that she dared to challenge him. The curse that followed Joan Rivers. The Late Show made its debut on October 9, 1986, but almost immediately ran into major roadblocks. A number of local stations refused to air it, partly because Joan Rivers' sharp comedic style worried them, but mostly because of loyalty to Johnny Carson. Carson's Tonight Show team had drawn a hard line. Any guest who appeared on Rivers' show would be banned for life from Carson's stage. That threat scared away big-name celebrities, leaving Joan's show scrambling for star power. The ratings nosedived. Behind the scenes, things grew even worse. Joan and her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, clashed constantly with both staff and Fox executives. When the network demanded that Joan fire her producer, Bill Rosenberg, she refused. That defiance cost them both their jobs, less than 9 months after the premiere. The collapse devastated Joan. Her marriage, already strained, began to fall apart. After more than 30 years together, she and Edgar quietly separated. Just 3 months after being fired, tragedy struck. Edgar died by suicide, overdosing on prescription pills. Losing him was not only a personal blow, but also a financial disaster. Edgar had been Joan's business manager, and it was revealed he had squandered much of her fortune. With her talk show gone, her friendship with Carson shattered, and her husband gone, she entered what she later described as one of the darkest chapters of her life. By the late 1980s, Joan's world had collapsed. Her Las Vegas contracts had dried up. Her reputation in the industry had been torched by Carson's team, and she felt like she'd been completely cast out. She described feeling like a non-person, shunned and unwelcome. The despair grew so heavy that at one point she held a gun, prepared to end her own life. But fate intervened. Her beloved dog, Spike, jumped into her lap, landing squarely on the weapon. In that heartbreaking but life-saving moment, one thought cut through her pain. Who would care for Spike if she was gone? That simple realization pulled her back from the edge. From then on, Joan rebuilt. She used her lowest moments not just to fuel a comeback, but also to help others. She became an outspoken advocate, lecturing about suicide and reminding people that even in their darkest hours, life could turn around. She often told audiences that no matter how bleak it feels, the storm will eventually pass. By 1987, she was beginning to regain her footing. She moved back to New York, buying a massive fixer-upper apartment that gave her something new to pour herself into. Renovating the mansion-like space provided a much-needed distraction, but soon she realized it wasn't just crumbling walls she was dealing with. Something else lingered inside that home, something that seemed determined to make its presence known. According to Joan, this unseen force didn't just haunt the house, it seemed to demand control, especially when it came to her design choices, terrifying anyone who dared to step through the door. Right after Joan Rivers began renovating her new apartment, it didn't take long for her, and anyone else who visited, to realize something wasn't quite right. From the very start, there seemed to be a presence in the building, one that clearly wasn't thrilled with the changes being made to what it considered its home. Rivers later recounted the whole ordeal on the show Celebrity Ghost Stories, sharing how unsettling the experience truly was. And it wasn't just her imagination. Neighbors claimed to have seen a ghostly figure more than once, sometimes dancing, sometimes simply wandering the halls as though it owned the place. Strange activity was so common in the building that it became almost routine. Even Rivers' dog wanted nothing to do with the apartment, refusing to step foot inside and trembling whenever brought near. Feeling helpless, Rivers turned to experts before even moving in. She contacted the parapsychology department at New York University, and they connected her with an unexpected source, a voodoo priestess living in Louisiana. Determined to find a solution, Rivers reached out, and the priestess agreed to help. When the priestess arrived in Manhattan, she carried out a full cleansing ritual. There was chanting, drumming, and the kind of ceremony designed to drive away stubborn spirits. Almost instantly, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. The air felt lighter, calmer, and most telling of all, Rivers' once frightened dog finally walked into the space without fear. But the ritual didn't stop at Rivers' door. Together, she and the priestess went through the entire building, knocking on doors and offering the same spiritual cleansing to neighbors. One by one, the residents agreed. During the process, the priestess revealed that the spirit's name was Mrs. Spencer, who she claimed had ties to the wealthy financier J.P. Morgan. For a while, Rivers finally felt at ease enough to settle in. But peace didn't last long. Strange disturbances returned, sometimes in the dead of night, other times in broad daylight. Desperate, Rivers tried to speak directly to the ghost, pleading for it to leave her alone. Nothing seemed to work. Then came a turning point. While exploring the building's basement, she stumbled across a portrait of Mrs. Spencer herself. Instead of reacting with fear, Rivers chose a different approach. She cleaned the portrait, placed it proudly in the lobby of the building, and even began leaving fresh flowers beside it. According to the priestess, this act of respect changed everything. Mrs. Spencer was pleased, not only with the flowers, but with the renovations as well. From that moment forward, Rivers and the spirit reached an unspoken truce. The comedian and the ghostly resident of her Manhattan home finally found a way to coexist in peace. The truth behind her 700 surgeries. Joan Rivers was impossible to separate from her appearance. Over the decades, her look transformed so much that it became as much a part of her legacy as her razor-sharp wit. She wasn't just known for her endless plastic surgery. She owned it, joked about it, and turned it into part of her brand. From the stage to television interviews, she never shied away from making herself the punchline. Her fascination with cosmetic work began early. Reports suggest that her first procedure was an eye lift in her early 30s, right around the same time she was breaking out on Johnny Carson's late-night show. That set the stage for a lifelong relationship with plastic surgery. She often admitted that she felt unattractive in her younger years and turned to surgery to boost her confidence. For Joan, it wasn't just vanity. It was survival in a business where staying fresh and camera-ready was part of the job. She explained in interviews that cosmetic work gave her self-esteem and made her genuinely happy. Even while critics speculated about the number of surgeries she had, Joan always kept her humor intact. Whether she was joking that she wished she had a twin to see what she might have looked like naturally, or comparing her body to Tupperware, she always managed to laugh at herself. Over time, wild numbers circulated about how many procedures she had actually undergone. Some claimed it was more than 700, while Joan herself once joked that the number was 739. The truth, according to her daughter Melissa, was closer to 365 surgeries, still an astonishing count, but far less than the most sensational headlines suggested. Melissa also revealed that, despite the insecurities her mother had battled for years, Joan found peace with her appearance in her later life. Joan herself chronicled much of this journey in her book, Men Are Stupid, and They Like Big Boobs, where she documented cosmetic procedures in detail, complete with asterisks next to the ones she personally had. She even turned that into a comedy moment when Graham Norton tallied the asterisks on his show, leaving the audience in stitches. Her openness about surgery wasn't limited to books or interviews. It spilled over into her stand-up. By the 1980s, with nose jobs, facelifts, liposuction, and Botox, she was already nearly unrecognizable from her younger self, yet she leaned into it, creating comedy from her own transformation. Melissa later wrote in her memoir, The Book of Joan, that her mother hadn't had as much done as people believed. Still, one procedure for nearly every day of the year was a staggering number. Joan herself never saw it as a burden. She even tied it into her views on mortality. As she grew older, she admitted to thinking about death often, but she wasn't afraid of it. She likened the feeling of going under anesthesia for surgery to slipping into a velvety black sleep, an image she used to describe what death might feel like. True to form, even on the subject of her own mortality, Joan never lost her comedic edge. On the night before the procedure that would ultimately claim her life, she stood on stage in Manhattan cracking jokes about death itself. She told the audience she could go at any moment, and with perfect timing, added that if it happened right there, they'd always have the bragging rights to say they were present the night Joan Rivers passed. Behind the curtain of Joan's final moments. Joan Rivers was famous for her sharp wit, her bold personality, and, yes, the countless cosmetic procedures she underwent over the course of her life. But the most heartbreaking twist of all is that her very last medical procedure in 2014, an endoscopy combined with a biopsy, is what ended her life. What makes the story even more devastating is that her passing may have been preventable. The people trusted with her care did not uphold the very oath they swore as medical professionals to protect their patient from harm. In the immediate aftermath, there was no autopsy performed. That decision was made by her daughter, Melissa Rivers, who requested it in accordance with Jewish law. Instead, the investigation relied on a less invasive examination and on the documents provided by the clinic where the procedure took place. The first findings revealed that Joan's brain had been deprived of oxygen, which ultimately caused her death. On the surface, this was not flagged as suspicious. Officially, the report called it a therapeutic complication, meaning it was considered a rare but known risk of the type of procedure she was undergoing. At that point, it seemed like a tragic accident. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something far more disturbing. Joan had only agreed to an endoscopy. She had never consented to a biopsy. Despite that, when her personal ear-nose-throat doctor requested the additional, unauthorized procedure, the clinic allowed it to happen. What followed was shocking. During that biopsy, the very one Joan never agreed to, her vocal cords went into spasm, and she stopped breathing. To make matters worse, a source revealed that the doctor allegedly paused to take a selfie during the procedure. That moment, that decision to go ahead with something she had not approved, is what directly led to her death. When Melissa Rivers learned of the unauthorized biopsy and the reported selfie, her grief turned to outrage. She publicly condemned what she described as medical mismanagement, incompetence, and a shocking lack of respect. And she wasn't going to stop at words. Melissa took action, filing a medical malpractice lawsuit against both the clinic and the doctors involved. The lawsuit laid out grave allegations supported by the New York Medical Examiner's finding that the procedure directly caused Joan's death. It accused the doctors at Yorkville Endoscopy in Manhattan of acting with recklessness and gross negligence, performing procedures she never consented to. Even more disturbing, it claimed that one of the physicians involved wasn't even authorized or properly credentialed to treat patients at the clinic. So, how did Joan end up at the clinic that day? According to the New York Medical Examiner, she was seeking answers for ongoing voice changes and stomach reflux. On paper, she gave written authorization for an upper endoscopy, also called an EGD. That consent included the possibility of a biopsy, removing polyps, or even dilating the esophagus if necessary. But the lawsuit drew a clear line. Joan never agreed to any other procedures beyond those listed. While some claimed she may have given verbal consent for more, the lawsuit insisted that no such approval was given. To understand what was supposed to happen, it helps to know what an upper endoscopy is. It's a procedure where a doctor inserts a thin, flexible tube with a camera to examine the esophagus, stomach, and the first part of the small intestine. A biopsy might be done if something suspicious appeared, since voice changes can sometimes indicate cancer. A polypectomy removes benign nasal polyps, which can obstruct breathing, and esophageal dilation is done when acid reflux causes narrowing, making swallowing painful or difficult. But Joan's case became complicated from the start. She first underwent a laryngoscopy, a throat exam not covered by her written consent. During this, her oxygen levels became unstable. When doctors moved forward with the endoscopy, anesthesiologist Dr. Renuka Bankula noticed her oxygen saturation dropped again and urged the team to stop and stabilize her. Once her levels improved, Dr. Lawrence Cohen reinserted the scope and continued. According to the lawsuit, this decision was a critical mistake. It claimed the doctors failed to maintain her airway properly and failed to monitor her declining vital signs. Joan's blood pressure, pulse, and oxygen levels dropped dramatically. Then came a startling allegation. Right after completing the endoscopy, Dr. Cohen paused to take a selfie with Joan while she was still under sedation, remarking that she might enjoy seeing the pictures later in recovery. The situation only worsened. Dr. Gwen Coravin, a well-known ENT who had treated major celebrities, decided to perform another laryngoscopy, even though written consent for that second exam did not exist. When Dr. Bankula raised concerns about Joan's fragile breathing, Cohen allegedly dismissed her as paranoid, and the second procedure went ahead. The medical examiner later determined Joan's death was caused by anoxic encephalopathy due to hypoxic arrest. Essentially, her brain was starved of oxygen. The lawsuit explained that her vocal cords went into spasm, blocking her airway and cutting off her oxygen supply. Without enough oxygen reaching her brain, her body shut down. The staff attempted to revive her by manually helping her breathe with an ambu bag for 10 minutes, but it failed. At that point, Bankula reportedly called for a tracheotomy set to be prepared, a surgical procedure that could have restored her airway. But instead, she sought out Dr. Coravin to attempt a different emergency procedure. The problem was, Coravin had already left the room. The lawsuit alleged that Coravin walked out because she knew she wasn't authorized to perform procedures at Yorkville Endoscopy. Although she was licensed and renowned in her field, she had no surgical privileges at that clinic. By leaving, she effectively abandoned the case at the very moment her patient was in crisis. The complaint also argued that the remaining staff weren't adequately trained to handle the emergency unfolding before them. When the case first hit the headlines, Yorkville Endoscopy released a statement defending their practices. They emphasized that patient safety was their priority, claiming their anesthesiologists continuously monitored patients with advanced equipment and stayed bedside throughout procedures and into recovery. They also highlighted that their doctors were certified in advanced cardiac life support, trained to respond to serious cardiac emergencies. But the lawsuit painted a far darker picture, one of mismanagement, poor decision-making, and preventable tragedy. After Dr. Gwen Korovin came under intense scrutiny following Joan Rivers' death, her legal team moved quickly to manage the story. They painted her as a highly respected figure in the medical world, someone admired by colleagues and deeply trusted by her patients. But when it came to the details of the incident, their tone was clear and measured. Korovin, they said, had a long-standing policy of never discussing her patients publicly. On top of that, strict state and federal confidentiality laws prevented her from speaking about any individual's care. For those reasons, her lawyers stated, neither she nor her team would address the ongoing press reports and asked that the media respect her policy and her patients' privacy. So, on one side, the clinic was doubling down on its claims of rigorous safety protocols, while on the other, Korovin's camp emphasized confidentiality and silence. For Melissa Rivers, silence was not an option. She released her own statement, and it carried the weight of both her grief and her determination. Filing the lawsuit, she admitted, was one of the hardest choices she had ever faced. But she believed no other family should have to endure the kind of pain she and her son Cooper were living through. Her words pulled no punches. She described the circumstances surrounding her mother's death as medical mismanagement, incompetence, and outrageous behavior. Shocking, almost incomprehensible in her view. Melissa stressed that this wasn't only about her mother. She wanted to make sure that every patient received the standard of care they deserved, and that no one else would ever experience such a preventable tragedy. By May 2016, the legal battle reached its conclusion. The Hollywood Reporter revealed that Melissa had reached a settlement with the clinic and the doctors involved. Although the case never went to trial, Melissa expressed relief that those responsible had accepted accountability quickly and without dispute. Still, no legal outcome could erase the loss. Melissa and her son continued to live with the absence of Joan, a larger-than-life figure who had been the heart of their family. Cooper, growing into a young man who bore a striking resemblance to his grandmother, carried that legacy in a very personal way. On the 10th anniversary of Joan's passing, Melissa marked the day with a short, emotional message on Instagram. She spoke of love, of missing her mother every single day, and of the comfort she found in knowing how deeply Joan was loved around the world. She acknowledged that while the day would always be difficult for her and Cooper, it was made easier by the continued support of fans, the loyal Joan Rangers, who had celebrated her mother's bold spirit and sharp humor for decades. At 81, Joan Rivers finally breaks silence on Johnny Carson. One of the most famous feuds in television history was the falling out between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers. Both were legends in their own right, but their personal and professional bond crumbled in the 1980s, leaving a story that has fascinated fans for decades. Carson, who was famously private, never publicly discussed the rupture. Bits and pieces of information trickled out over the years, but he kept his silence until the end of his life. Rivers, however, had no problem speaking about it, especially after Carson's death. She threw sharp words his way, even insisting they once shared a brief romantic encounter she cheekily described as a one-night bounce. To her, their relationship was a whirlwind of mentorship, betrayal, and unresolved feelings. A previously unaired interview later brought this complicated dynamic back into the spotlight. Speaking on EW Radio, Rivers reflected on what she thought Carson could have done differently. She imagined a theatrical moment where, after her career setbacks, her husband Edgar Rosenberg's tragic suicide in 1987, and her departure from Fox, Carson might have welcomed her back on The Tonight Show with a simple, "Where you been?" In her view, that gesture would have healed wounds, grabbed headlines, and cemented Carson as a man of integrity. Rivers had always credited Carson for jump-starting her career. In an op-ed she wrote for People magazine in 1986, she explained that her decision to leave The Tonight Show had nothing to do with him personally. Still, the way he found out stung. After juggling offers from other networks and sensing her position at NBC was in jeopardy, she accepted the chance to host The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. She intended to tell Carson herself, but before she could, the news reached him through someone else. When she finally tried to explain over the phone, he hung up. That was the end of their relationship, on camera and off. For Rivers, the loss cut deep. She admitted Carson had been the first powerful figure to recognize her talent, respect her work, and open the door to her future. In her words, he handed her a career. Yet when he died in 2005, her public comments were laced with bitterness. Reports from the time quoted her calling him cruel, even a bastard. Then came the twist. Claims that she and Carson had shared at least one intimate night. Stories that blurred the line between truth and Rivers' flair for the dramatic. By the time Joan Rivers passed away in 2014, during what was supposed to be a minor throat procedure, their feud had already taken on a legendary status. Biographer Leslie Bennett later added more fuel in her book, Last Girl Before Freeway, where she detailed Rivers' claims of relationships with powerful men, including Carson and even John F. Kennedy. Whether their rumored fling really happened or not, the rift between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers remains one of late-night television's most infamous stories.